Salut, my name's Gabrielle and here's a video all about reading in French. Basically everything I wish I knew before I started to read en francais. So just for a bit of context, I started learning French 4 years ago when I arrived in France without speaking any French. And since then, I've passed my ffkdfhksd, which is a French proficiency exam. So in this video, I'll talk about what you need to know if you are in between a B1 and a B2 level of French, and if you want to improve your compréhension écrite. So for those of you who don't know, a B1 level of French would mean that you understand things like daily routines, you can talk about your likes, your dislikes, but if you are at a B2 level of French, you'll be able to understand more nuanced opinions and you'd have like a wider vocabulary, essentially. But you're not quite fluent, you still make some mistakes and you're still looking for new words to learn. The first thing I'd like to mention is that there are a couple of different ways that you can read. There is passive reading where you're not so concerned about understanding every single word, you just kind of want to get the gist of the story. But then there's active reading where you underline the words you don't know and then you look them up and you try to find the pronunciations for them. And my controversial opinion is that neither of them are better or worse, it just really depends upon what you want to get out of the reading experience. Personally, there are books that I read to get more vocabulary, but then there are also books that aren't so useful to read, to be honest with you. So for instance, I'm currently reading Nana en francais. I also read Sailor Moon in French, and I honestly couldn't justify spending time reading manga in English, so I was like, I'm gonna turn it into a productivity French study session. I'm gonna read manga. But reading in a foreign language really doesn't have to be just opening a book and looking at pages. What you can do as well is get the physical copy of the book and an audiobook version of it and just like listen to the book while reading the words. This will be brilliant for your pronunciation. But then also if you want to improve upon like understanding French phonetics, then you can use this website to basically type in any new words that you find, and then it'll actually show you an example of real people using this word in a phrase so that you can better get that word to stick into your head. With regards to what books you should actually read, there's a whole world of French literature that goes beyond Harry Potter and Le Petit Prince. So here are some recommendations based on what I found pretty easy to understand. First of all, Ernaux. I'd particularly recommend this author because her whole writing style is very straight to the point. I've read 3 of her books so far, Une femme, la place, and l'événement. So I'd personally recommend Ernaux because her whole writing style is very straight to the point. Écriture plate. Prononciation. She uses very simple language that is still so effective and really tugs at your heartstrings. The way she describes her books is as being autosociobiographies, because although she talks about her own experiences and stories of people close to her, these situations can really apply to a lot of people growing up in her generation. I think the more books you read by Ernaux, the bigger appreciation you have for her as a person and also her writing because it's incredible. In particular, I'd recommend for you to read La Place and Une Femme because these 2 books basically tell the story of her mom and of her father, basically of the entirety of their lives before they passed away. And Une Femme was a particular tearjerker for me because I'm very close to my mom, and you can actually get an édition scolaire. Finding some school editions of her books isn't so difficult, and I am forcing my book club to read Regarde les lumières, mon amour. Look at the lights, my darling. I think I talked about Ernaux for way too long. The second author I want to talk about is Djaili Amadou Amal, who wrote Les Impatiences and Cœur du Sahel, and whatever else she writes, I will absolutely be reading because I was so sucked into the stories of the women in these books. The first book she wrote, Les Impatiences, talks about 3 women in high society in Maroua and the difficulties that they face. For instance, the first main character of this book is forced to marry a man who is way older than her. And then the third main character of the book is the first wife of this man. But what was a particular tearjerker for me was Cœur du Sahel, which made me want to just kind of like dive into the book and give Faida, the main character, a big hug because this book it's basically a story of resilience, the importance of education, overcoming adversity, and getting emotional just like thinking about it. But it's a really beautifully written book, and honestly the 2 of these you could read if you have a high B1 level or a B2 level of French. I found this one to be a bit more easier to read than Coeur du Sahel. But then also do make sure to look up the trigger warnings before diving into these books. But if you are not so much of a confident reader in French, but you still want to try your hand at it, I'd recommend the parallel text short stories in French by Penguin Books. I think that's the publisher. This is exactly what it sounds like. It's basically just short stories whereby one page is in French and the other page is in English, so that when you're reading the French side, if you don't know a word, you can just look over to the next page and figure it out like that. And then moving on from all that, it took me way too long to realize this is an option, but if you want, you can actually read Japanese literature that is translated into French, which can be particularly cool if you like a particular Japanese author, but their work isn't translated into English yet. For instance, this book by Hiro Arikawa isn't actually translated into English yet, and so it was an absolute delight reading it en francais. And then speaking about my book club again, I'm actually forcing the other book club that I'm in to read Before the Coffee Gets Cold. For some reason, I find that translations of Japanese books to be quite straightforward, and they never really have a lot of vocabulary that is quite difficult to understand at a B2 level. Particularly looking forward to read Tant que le café est encore chaud, which is Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi, which is a part of my absolute favorite book series of all time. This is the second book that I'm reading with my book club. I've already read all of these books in English, so I was like, oh, well, I'll just take this as an opportunity to read it in French as well and see how different the translation will be. And if you're not a really confident reader just yet, there is still always the option of reading children's books in French, and surprisingly, you can find some that are entertaining to read even as an adult. For instance, Elizabeth. Oops. For instance, this one. And it was absolutely adorable to discover France through the eyes of a Breton orphan. But I really loved this one too. It's Comment Mélisande le petit sorcier découvrir les secrets du bonheur. So I really hope that you got some use out of this video. I have loads of books here that I need to put back onto my shelf. And if you have any questions about studying French, the Delft B2 exam, or anything really, don't hesitate to comment down below. I'll be happy to respond to all of the comments. Bye!